London, in the early 2010s, was a city of striking contrasts. For many, it was a place of opportunity, culture, and constant movement. But for those growing up in certain estates, the picture was very different. Concrete tower blocks and dimly lit alleyways created environments where young people often felt overlooked and trapped. Poverty, unemployment, and a lack of support made the pull of street life stronger with each passing year. Gangs were not just about crime. They were about identity, protection, and survival. 4 boys, as young as 12 or 13, joining a group of older youths seemed less like a choice and more like the only way to navigate a world where showing weakness could get you hurt. Amid this backdrop was Daniel Hayes, a teenager who never set out to become infamous, but who found himself slowly drifting into the orbit of gang culture. He was only 15 when his name started to circulate among local crews. A boy who was smart, quick, and eager to prove himself. His life at home was difficult. His single mother worked long hours, and Daniel often felt invisible at school, where teachers saw him as another restless student with little interest in lessons. The estate, however, offered him a different kind of recognition. Older gang members noticed him hanging around, running small errands, and trying to act tougher than his years. To them, he was useful. To Daniel, their approval felt like belonging. At first, the jobs were simple and low risk. He would act as a lookout when older boys conducted drug deals. He would deliver sealed packages, never asking what was inside. Sometimes, he would keep watch over stairwells to make sure police or rivals weren't approaching. Each task earned him small amounts of money pocket change compared to the profits the older men were making. But for Daniel, it felt like wealth. He could buy trainers, clothes, and small luxuries that set him apart from his peers at school. More importantly, he began to carry himself with a confidence he had never felt before. A swagger that told others he was part of something bigger. But London was changing around him. Police operations against organized crime were pushing gangs into tighter corners, and disputes over territory were turning more violent. Knife crime and shootings became regular news stories. Yet inside the estates, these events were not headlines, but part of everyday life. Each corner of the city had its own groups, and boundaries were marked by invisible lines that only locals truly understood. For Daniel, venturing outside his own area meant risking a confrontation with rivals, even if he wasn't directly involved in the feud. By late 2012, Daniel was already seen as someone to watch. His willingness to do what others his age avoided gave him a reputation, and reputations in Gangland, London, could be dangerous. To the older members of his crew, he was an asset, someone young and expendable, who could be trusted to follow instructions. To rival gangs, he was a symbol of the next generation, a boy becoming a soldier far too early. Though Daniel himself might not have realized it, the path he was walking was narrowing with every step. The streets that once gave him a sense of belonging were beginning to close in, and in the shadows of the city, his name was being spoken not with admiration, but with suspicion. What started as a search for identity would soon draw him into events far darker than he could have imagined. By the time Daniel turned 16, the streets that had once seemed like a playground of opportunity had turned into a chessboard where every move mattered. His involvement with the gang had deepened, not because he actively sought power, but because the world around him kept demanding more. Older members saw that he was dependable. He didn't question orders, didn't hesitate to take risks, and he moved without drawing the attention that older, more recognizable faces would. This reliability elevated him from simple errands to tasks that carried weight. He began collecting money from local dealers, delivering small consignments of drugs, and even passing coded messages between rival crews who were, at times, forced to cooperate. These jobs gave him a glimpse into how organized the network really was. It was no longer just boys on scooters and stairwell exchanges. It was a system that operated like a shadow business. The money came faster than ever. Daniel suddenly had cash to buy clothes that made him look older, phones that marked his status, and even the respect of peers who once ignored him. On the surface, it looked like he was thriving, but beneath the surface, danger was growing. His willingness to get involved in every corner of gang activity meant he was being noticed beyond his own estate. Rival gangs began recognizing his face, and whispers spread that the boy was moving more than he should. Handling jobs meant for older and more experienced members. To some, it looked like ambition. To others, it looked like a threat. What made Daniel stand out most wasn't just his fearlessness, but his knowledge. Unlike many teenagers who blindly followed orders, he began piecing together how the gang worked. He noticed who gave instructions, who collected money, and which addresses were used for storing goods. He knew the safe routes, the drop-off points, and the coded language used in everyday dealings. This knowledge was dangerous. In a world where trust was fragile and betrayal was common, anyone who held too much information became a liability. Rivals began asking questions about what Daniel knew, and even some within his own crew started to wonder if the boy might one day become too clever for his own good. At the same time, violence across London's gang landscape was intensifying. Shootings that once shocked communities were becoming more frequent, and teenagers younger than Daniel were being stabbed in disputes over minor slights or mistaken identity. Police crackdowns forced gangs to operate more cautiously, but it also made them more paranoid. Every new face was scrutinized, and every move had to be justified. For Daniel, this paranoia meant that his loyalty was constantly under quiet examination. Though he had given no reason for anyone to doubt him, the very fact that he was rising so quickly through the ranks made others wary. His reputation, once a source of pride, was beginning to paint a target on his back. 2 rivals. He was seen as a promising recruit of an enemy crew, someone whose removal would weaken their opponents. To some within his own gang, he was a potential risk, a teenager holding information usually reserved for seasoned veterans. By 16, Daniel was no longer invisible. His name carried weight in the wrong conversations, and in the hidden world of Gangland, London. Such attention was often the first step toward becoming a target. The spring of 2014 was supposed to be just another season in Daniel's life, but it became the period when everything shifted beyond the point of no return. By then, he was seen as more than just a messenger or errand boy. He had been entrusted with responsibilities that blurred the line between youthful involvement and full membership in the underworld. Yet for all the trust he seemed to enjoy, invisible forces were moving against him. Rivals had been watching his movements, noting the regular paths he took and the contacts he kept. The whispers that he carried too much knowledge were no longer just talk. They had turned into a plan. The setup was simple in design, but devastating in execution. A message reached Daniel that he was needed to collect money owed from a smaller crew operating near These kinds of jobs were common, and he had done them before, without incident. To him, it likely seemed like routine business, an easy task that would earn him more favor with the older members. He could not have known that those waiting for him had no intention of handing over anything but violence. On the evening of the meeting, the car park chosen as the location stood eerily quiet. It was a place often used for secret transactions, its isolation both an advantage and a trap. CCTV from nearby streets would later show 2 unfamiliar vehicles circling the area in the minutes before Daniel arrived, their headlights sweeping across the pavement like predators scanning for prey. Witnesses later reported hearing the faint hum of engines idling in the distance, but at the time, no one realized what was about to unfold. When Daniel entered the car park, he was alone, carrying himself with the casual confidence of someone who had done this before. The shadows hid more than darkness that night. Figures were waiting, their plan already set. The attack came swiftly. Shots rang out, echoing against the concrete walls, sharp and cold in the evening air. Residents nearby thought they had heard fireworks, only to realize too late what had happened. Daniel was struck at close range, the ambush leaving him no chance to react. His body fell where he had stood moments earlier, the life of a 16-year-old cut off in seconds. The aftermath was chaos. Calls flooded into emergency services, and armed police units rushed to the scene. Paramedics fought to save him, but the damage was irreversible. By the time his mother was notified, Daniel's life had already slipped away. The news spread quickly across the estate, sending waves of shock through a community already accustomed to tragedy. But this time was different. This time, the victim was not an older gang figure known for years of violence, but a boy barely out of childhood. Someone who should have been planning exams and dreaming of futures, not meeting a violent end in a deserted car park. The murder instantly carried weight beyond the usual cycle of gang retaliation. At 16, Daniel became the youngest Gangland murder victim London had seen, and his death ignited questions that no one wanted to answer. Who had set him up? Was it simply rivals targeting a promising recruit, or had someone closer to him decided that he knew too much? The silence of the streets swallowed the truth, but suspicion began to spread, darkening the legacy of a boy whose life had ended before it had truly begun. The investigation into Daniel's murder began with urgency. Not only because of the brutality of the crime, but also because of the age of the victim. Detectives knew that public pressure would be immense. A 16-year-old being gunned down in what was clearly a planned attack demanded answers, and the Metropolitan Police launched one of their most complex gang-related investigations of the year. At first, the scene offered little. The car park was poorly lit, and though officers recovered shell casings, the attackers had been careful. Vehicles linked to the shooting had false plates, and the killers had worn masks. Yet even in the careful planning, mistakes had been made, and detectives began the slow process of piecing together the puzzle. One of the earliest clues came from phone data. In the hours before Daniel's death, his phone had received a series of messages, some deleted within seconds of being read. Digital forensics revealed that these came from a prepaid handset that disappeared immediately after the shooting, but through cell site analysis, investigators discovered the burner phone had been active in the same areas where known rival gang members lived. This didn't give names, but it narrowed the focus. Detectives started pulling on threads, cross-referencing movements of suspects with the timeline of the attack. As the investigation deepened, officers began hearing whispers from informants. In the shadowy world of London gangs, loyalty was fragile, and the shocking fact that Daniel was so young seemed to have shaken even hardened criminals. Rumors spread that his killing hadn't been entirely the work of rivals. There were suggestions that someone within his own circle may have provided the information that allowed the ambush to happen. Detectives found themselves looking not just at external enemies, but also at those who had called Daniel a brother. CCTV from nearby shops provided another breakthrough. Hours before the murder, a familiar vehicle was captured trailing Daniel. As he made his way toward the meeting point, the car belonged to an associate from his own crew, a man who claimed to have been elsewhere at the time. Under questioning, his story began to crumble. Phone records placed him near the car park minutes before the shooting, and further investigation revealed that he had been in contact with a rival leader only days earlier. This raised a disturbing possibility that Daniel had been sacrificed in a deal between gangs. A pawn in an agreement to settle debts or remove a liability. As detectives dug deeper, the motive became clearer. Daniel had grown too valuable and too knowledgeable for his own safety. His awareness of stash houses, routes, and high-ranking members meant he was both an asset and a threat. If he ever turned on his crew or was pressured by police, he could expose the structure of the network. For older members trying to secure their own positions, his removal made sense, however brutal. The revelation left investigators with a chilling picture. Daniel's death was not just an impulsive act of rivalry, but a calculated execution orchestrated by people he trusted. For the public, this detail remained hidden for months, but within the police files, it became the central truth. The boy who had sought belonging had instead been betrayed by the very world he had worked so hard to be part of. His killing was no longer seen as just another act of gang violence, but as a sign of how ruthless and transactional the underworld had become, where even a teenager could be eliminated for the sake of convenience. The trial that followed Daniel's death drew national attention. Courtrooms filled with reporters, community leaders, and devastated family members who struggled to understand how a teenager had become the center of such a brutal conspiracy. Prosecutors laid out the evidence piece by piece, showing how phone records, CCTV footage, and hidden financial trails tied the killers together. They revealed the chilling detail that Daniel's own associate had provided the final piece of information that allowed the ambush to take place. What shocked many was not only the betrayal, but the cold logic behind it. To those who had orchestrated the crime, Daniel was expendable, a liability in a business that thrived on fear and silence. As witnesses came forward, the image of London's gang world became clearer to the wider public. Testimonies described a life where children were used as pawns. deliberately drawn into a cycle of errands, deliveries, and eventually violence. It was not about choice, but about grooming. A process that left boys like Daniel feeling trapped in a system they could not escape. The jury listened as experts explained how gangs operated like businesses, exploiting the youngest members while shielding the older leaders from direct involvement. For many, it was the first time the inner workings of these hidden networks had been so openly dissected. The verdict brought some measure of closure, though it could not undo the tragedy. Several men were convicted of murder, with sentences that would keep them behind bars for decades. Others faced charges for conspiracy and firearms offenses, while a handful of suspected accomplices remained out of reach, either through lack of evidence or their disappearance from London altogether. For Daniel's family, the convictions were hollow victories. His mother, who had fought to keep him away from the streets, was left mourning a son whose life had ended before it had truly begun. The trial might have answered the question of who was responsible, but it could never explain why a child had been placed in such danger in the first place. In the aftermath, the case sparked debates far beyond the courtroom. Politicians and community leaders pointed to Daniel's story as a symbol of the urgent need for intervention in Britain's estates. Youth services that had been cut back were suddenly in the spotlight, with campaigners arguing that without safe spaces and guidance, more children would follow the same path. Media coverage framed Daniel as both victim and warning, a reminder of how easily a teenager could be consumed by gang life when support systems failed. His name became attached to discussions on knife crime, youth exploitation, and the so-called county lines operations that stretched beyond London into towns and villages across the country, for those still involved in gangs. However, the lessons were more immediate. The betrayal that ended Daniel's life served as a grim reminder of the ruthless nature of the world they inhabited. Trust became thinner, suspicion grew sharper, and the knowledge that even the youngest could be targeted created a climate of constant fear. Daniel's death did not end the cycle of violence, but it exposed its cruelty in a way that could not be ignored. His story became one more scar on the city, a reminder etched into headlines and court documents, of how a boy seeking belonging had been turned into London as youngest Gangland murder victim.